did a talk with yesterday for Band-Aid Lyme. There's a Lyme conference that's virtual that I believe it's in March. I'm not sure if it's March or April when it's going to be aired, but Enid Haller and a bunch of great people are going to be talking at that conference also. So biofilms and persisters are extremely important. And I'll show you tonight that, in the past, we were using drugs that hit the logarithmic forms, the actively growing forms of Borrelia with penicillins and cephalosporins. And we were hitting the cystic forms of Lyme. I had actually published the first abstract on flagellin back probably 25 years ago. I didn't know it hit cystic forms. Dr. Borschen showed it 6 months later. We use plaquenil and grapefruit seed extract these days for some of the cystic forms, otherwise known as S forms, L forms, cell wall deficient, round body forms. But the most important forms that I found, especially because Bartonella is infecting so many of our patients, is using the intracellular drugs and combos, like doxycycline or minocycline, with rifampin or rifabutin, with, for example, zithromax, Biaxin, or even other macrolides that come from Europe, like roxithromycin, which we've had some help with. And then using drugs like pyrazinamide that have been used for tuberculosis to shorten the course of persisters. And I find that when I use these multiple intracellular combos, especially for people with Lyme and Bartonella, and then we start using combos of dapsone and even disulfiram, and we're using zithromax, for example, with methylene blue, which John Hopkins showed hits BART persisters, because until the last couple of years, we didn't know that Bartonella had persisters, just like we didn't know about Lyme, right? And the only reason I even knew to look at dapsone is because when the researchers like Dr. Ying Zhang at Hopkins was talking about Lyme being a persister bacteria, for those of us in the trenches, we all knew that Lyme persisted. That wasn't the issue. But when he said it was a persister bacteria, he meant like, oh, you mean it's like leprosy and tuberculosis, right? So these were persister bacteria that when I was doing my internal medicine training at Mount Sinai in New York City during the HIV epidemic, we were seeing a lot of Mycobacterium avium intracellularly in the HIV patients. And I was using a lot of NIH and rifampin and pyrazinamide in these drugs at that point. I got very comfortable using TB drugs. And I was waiting for the use of these drugs. I needed an excuse to use tuberculosis drugs for Lyme. Now, we'd all been using rifampin for a long time. And in fact, it's even good for people who have ehrlichiosis who can't tolerate tetracyclines. But none of us had ever used, for example, pyrazinamide or dapsone, which is mainly used for leprosy. Rifampin and dapsone is used to treat leprosy for 1 year and cure it. And leprosy, Mycobacterium leprae, is a persister bacteria. So I looked at dapsone and I said, all right, what are the qualities of this drug? Number one, it's anti-inflammatory. Well, I just told you that a lot of the reason people have symptoms of Lyme and, of course, of COVID is inflammation. Number two, it is excellent penetration into the brain. Well, we need that for all the Lyme patients that have neuropsychiatric symptoms with memory and concentration problems and sleep disorders and ringing in the ears and dizziness, right? And sleep, right? It's affecting the central nervous system. And it hits persisters. So this drug hits these particular organisms that are dormant sitting in biofilms. And dapsone actually has an effect on biofilms, as does, by the way, rifampin. I'll show you the study that we did in culture. So it had a lot of effects. And the fourth one, which surprised me, was it has an anti-malarial effect. And of course, all of our patients, just about 90–95%, have been exposed to babesiosis, whether Babesia microti or Babesia duncani. So the drug had all of the characteristics of something that I wanted to use. And I said, well, if it and it hits tularemia, right? It hits all these other tick-borne infections. Therefore, maybe it's effective. And lo and behold, it was effective. So oxidative stress and inflammation, whether we're talking about Lyme, whether we're talking about COVID, it's underlying all acute and chronic illness that you might see, whether it's Alzheimer's and inflammation in the brain, heart attacks, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, asthma, atherosclerosis, it's all due to inflammation. So the basic question then is, how do we lower the NRF2 pathway with antioxidants, phytochemicals like curcumin, green tea, resveratrol, and sulforaphane glucosinolate. We block activation of glial cells in the brain. I just actually saw a Lyme patient today in my medical barn. A lot of neuropsychiatric symptoms. We put them on LDN, 4.5 milligrams. It blocks toll-like receptor 4 signaling. and it shifts immune responses to a Th1. And you need a Th1 response, by the way, to go after the intracellular pathogens, which is where a lot of these tick-borne infections are hiding. It's these microglial cells in the brain from activating. So LDN, I've been on LDN probably for over a decade. Diet, right? More of a Mediterranean type diet, avoiding your allergic and sensitive. It's a really important point. If you've not been tested for leaky gut and food allergies, and you've not tried off gluten and wheat, dairy, sugar, right? Some of the most common allergens and dietary things that people have a problem with, you really need to try this, including a low histamine diet. Because a lot of my patients are histamine sensitive. Many are coming in with mast cell activation. And if you're having active inflammation because of your gut not being in place, because leaky gut and you're eating the wrong foods, you have gluten sensitivity, you can do a Cyrex panel, look at 20 gluten markers. You've got to make sure the gut is in order because it's a hidden form of inflammation, right? Not sleeping at night will inflame you. Not enough zinc will inflame you. Lyme, Bartonella, Babesia will inflame you. But the microbiome of the gut and what's going on in the gut, really important. So don't ignore the diet and speak to your doctor about looking at those aspects. You've got to check your minerals both in the serum and red blood cell because many of our patients are mineral deficient. The soils have now been depleted. Eating an orange today compared to 80 years ago, you're getting about a 50th of the nutrients that you were getting. So we all now need to supplement with multi-minerals, and some of us with multivitamins, depending on your diet. So you may need some zinc, some copper, and magnesium. A lot of my patients feel better with magnesium because you need magnesium for over 300 different detoxifying enzymes in the body. You need to get proper sleep and exercise. So we don't use things like Ambien, Lunesta, Sonata, but there are drugs. The last book, How Can I Get Better? Look under Lyme and sleep. Take a look at things like trazodone, doxepin, very low dose Flexeril, cyclobenzaprine, 5 milligrams at bedtime. Look at low dose Remeron, 7.5 milligrams. Take a look at some of these other things, Lyrica, things that are not typical drugs, but can help put you to sleep and get you into stage 3, stage 4 non-REM sleep so you can get a good night's sleep. Also, a little bit of exercise. We're going to talk about the infections in just a second. Detoxification is crucial. So if you're not actively detoxifying and you're killing off these bugs and getting a lot of Herxheimer reactions, you're going to feel sick all the time and you're never going to feel better while you're treating the Lyme. So you've got to make sure all of your detox pathways are being open, both phase 1 and phase problem. You may want to do infrared saunas and sweat out through the skin, but you've got to work all the detoxification pathways, exercise to get the lymphatics going. Detox, 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 really important if you're going to get better from this. The next most important one is balancing the hormones. I have a lot of patients come in that have never had an adrenal test. Do a DHEA salivary adrenal test for Doctor's Data or any of the good functional medicine labs out there. The majority of my patients have low adrenal. If you have low adrenal, the battery in your body is low and you can fix everything else on the MSIDS map, but you're not going to get better in the same way. Same thing, a lot of men come in with low testosterone, their libido's down, right? So you've got to check the hormones because when you have inflammation, it affects the hypothalamic pituitary axis, the HPA axis, and it shuts it down. So it's going to shut down luteinizing hormone, FSH, a lot of your other hormones. And then, of course, if you have mold, you need to look at the posterior pituitary with MSH, VIP, and ADH. You may need to heal the damage to the body and repair the mitochondria. Usually after I do 8 weeks of double dose dapsone, I routinely give people a 1-month mitochondrial regeneration. ATP 360, 3 a day from Research Nutritionals. CoQ Power, 400 milligrams twice a day from Research Nutritionals. Carnitex, acetyl L-carnitine, 1,000 milligrams twice, and the last one, Inada, NADH, 5 milligrams once a day. Sometimes we use also D-ribose, but not often because of glycosylation. Very helpful in a certain number of patients because all this free radical oxidative stress, right? If you've damaged the mitochondria, even if you're kicking out the infections and you've treated the POTS, and you've gotten to sleep and you're exercising, your hormones are balanced, right? If you don't heal the damage to the body, and that includes number 10, the damage to the mind, a lot of us coming into the offices of Lyme docs are the walking wounded, right? You've had trauma, whether it's physical trauma, emotional trauma, or sexual trauma. About a third of the patients who come to see me have told me in privacy that they have been sexually abused. I mean, please don't get me talking about the education system and what we need to be teaching men in the society. And by the way, women, the hallmark of what I'm going to come to at the end of this talk, when I talk to you about the climate, one of the solutions is you, the mothers of the world. You brought life into this world. You're going to need to help protect the planet. I'm going to tell you at the end of this talk what to do. But please don't ignore the mind and emotions. If you need to do EMDR for trauma, if you need to do neurofeedback, if you need to do cognitive behavioral therapy, anti-hopper, DNRS, there's a lot of things to do, and meditate and do yoga, Tai Chi, whatever you want to do. But please do not ignore the role of the mind, because if you have been traumatized and deep inside, you have this message that you got from cracked mirrors. And I say that because any healthy mirror reflects back to you. You are a loving, wonderful human being with your own gift to give to the world. It's only cracked mirrors that do this kind of crazy stuff to human beings, because normally they were traumatized and they didn't know how not to pass it on. But you have to know how to heal that. You have to know how to go to the little one and tell the little one inside that they are fine, that it's the other people that was a problem. And you need to be able to get to the root of that, because without doing the mind-body healing, the immune system sometimes will say to itself, you know, I don't deserve to get better. And I've been surprised, honestly, so much how the mind-body emotion works. So please, I don't want to overdo that point, but it's very important. Diagnostic testing. I don't need to tell most of you on the line today how bad it is. Part of the reason is what's called Borrelia sensu species. There are many different species of Lyme. There's about 17 in Europe, over 8 in the United States. And the reason I mainly use the Lyme immunoblot from IGeneX, the IgM and IgG immunoblot, is because it checks for 8 different species of Borrelia sensu. So to simplify this for you, someone you know doesn't know if they have Lyme disease. They're not Medicare. IGeneX is covered 5 tests by Medicare. They want to find out if they have Lyme disease. Send off an IgM and an IgG immunoblot, and you're going to play Lyme bingo, looking for any of the 5 specific Borrelia bands. Because if any one of those bands shows up on an immunoblot, 23, 31, 34, 39, 83/93, any one of those bands shows up, bingo, you have been exposed to a Borrelia species. The 2-tiered testing is going to miss it in about 50% of the cases. And when we studied chronic Lyme patients several years ago in Precision Medicine 1, only 20% of our chronic Lyme patients ever said that they had an EM rash. Not what's going around where, oh yeah, it's like 70, 75%. Nope, not in chronic Lyme disease. Another reason we can't find antibodies. Why are your ELISAs and your C6 ELISAs negative? Because of circulating immune complexes where antibodies and antigens come together, they come out of the blood, you just can't find the antibodies. Quick note, if you have a C6 ELISA that is positive, it cross-reacts with Borrelia miyamotoi relapsing fever. So if you don't have all the symptoms of classic Lyme, but it kind of smells like Lyme, like borreliosis, and you have a positive C6, you need to get tested for relapsing fever. You can, of course, do it for soft tick relapsing fever and hard tick relapsing fever, Borrelia miyamotoi. There's a great relapsing fever panel, also antibody and PCR that IGeneX does. Borrelia subverts a B-cell response. Why don't we get IgG antibodies that are positive in Lyme? Because when Borrelia goes into your lymph nodes, and this is what Nicole Baumgart discovered in mice, right, at the University of California. She discovered that when Borrelia invades the lymph nodes, you stop making IgG antibodies, you make IgM. We saw exactly the same thing in our chronic Lyme patients. Low IgG levels, high IgM, and IgM is just not as effective as trying to clear a chronic infection. So there's a lot of limitations of Lyme testing. You can go straight to the immunoblots, IgM, IgG. Do local labs, not a reason to use LabCorp, Quest, BioReference. By all means, you can do an IgM and IgG Western blot, an ELISA, do a C6 ELISA. You can check your Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, Q fever, tularemia, brucella, typhus. You can check your tick-borne infections, Babesia microti, Duncani. You can do this through local labs. There's no reason you have to go out of your network initially. But if it's negative, especially for Babesia bartonella, you got to use the specialty labs because they're just not going to pick up all these different strains. So how do you make the clinical diagnosis of Lyme? Many of you may know that Dr. Freeman and I published the first validated Lyme questionnaire with Mariella Cetera from the University of New Paltz. This was about a 4-year study in 1,600 Lyme patients. And in this study, we found that it was 87% accurate. It was more accurate than doing a two-tiered test. So when we want to figure out if someone has Lyme, we give them this questionnaire. We'll send off an ELISA or a C6 ELISA, and there's the immunoblot highlighted in red. I'll usually do fish testing for Babesia bartonella to see if it's active. I can't use Galaxy in New York, but I have found some T-Lab testing that has been useful. Marna Erickson has, some great stuff that she's doing there also with fish testing for Lyme and Bartonella. But it's those 5 bands, OSP-C23, OSP-A31, OSP-B34, 39, 83, 93. If you have good and bad days that come and go with migratory joint pain and moving around your body, migratory muscle pain, migratory nerve pain, tingling, numbness, stabbing, burning sensations that's moving around, that is the pathognomonic hallmark of Lyme disease. So if you have good and bad days with those symptoms, you've got brain fog and concentration problems, and you can't fall asleep, and you've got headaches, and you're anxious and you're depressed, and you've got palpitations and chest pain, you've got drenching night sweats, a cough and shortness of breath. These are the classic symptoms of Lyme and Babesia, a lot of times with Bartonella overlapping. So this screening questionnaire, we published it in the International Journal of General Medicine. It's got 4 sections, a symptom checklist, initially based on Dr. Boroscano's questions, but we added questions to it for severity and frequency to be able to score it. You then added a Lyme incidence scales. Do you have migratory symptoms? How many days per month are you healthy or sick? And a common Lyme score. And the key to the questionnaire is a score over 63, your high likelihood of having Lyme, especially again, if migratory pain is present. Now, if you have migratory pain, this is important to know. There's only 7 diseases in medicine that cause migratory pain. And most of the time, going into a Lyme doctor or any doctor's office, you are not normally going to walk in with acute rheumatic fever, Crohn's disease with bloody diarrhea, gonococcal arthritis, an acute case of hepatitis, having reactive arthritis or Reiter's or lupus. Not that it can't happen, but 99.9% of the time with the symptoms I just described to you, it is Lyme. But if you do happen to have symptoms of that are consistent with some of these other things, absolutely get it checked out. But as an internist who learns how to take a clinical history, you got to know what the 7 diseases that cause migratory pain, and you got to tell your doctor about them if he starts telling you you have a negative Lyme test and you don't have Lyme. So when we did the HMQ factors, the Horowitz MSIDS factors, the first that came up was neuropathy, tingling, numbness, burning, stabbing sensation, cognitive dysfunction, memory, concentration problems right afterwards, musculoskeletal pain that migrated, fatigue, dysautonomia. These are all you POTS patients that you stand up and you get dizzy and you feel like you're going to pass out and you have palpitations and fatigue and brain fog. And the treatment for that is not antibiotics. The treatment is salt and fluids, medicines that raise your blood pressure like fludrocortisone, midodrine, droxidopa, vagal retraining. So sometimes the symptoms that are ongoing from Lyme that you think you need antibiotics is because you haven't properly diagnosed with POTS dysautonomia. And the last one is cardiorespiratory. So this is a validated questionnaire in 1,600 people. We did it in 3 medical practices. Migratory pain is significant. It had convergent and divergent construct validity, predictive validity. What that means is it works. 87% accurate, score over 63, high probability of Lyme. Between 45 and 62, moderate probability, 25 to 44 possible. So where do you find this questionnaire? Go back to the website that I just described to you, www.cangetbetter.com. You'll see that there is a tab that says symptoms. The questionnaire is right there and you can score it. And if you're positive on questions 1 and or 22, it's very likely you have babesiosis with day sweats, night sweats, fevers, chills, air hunger where you can't catch your breath, and you don't have a history of asthma or postnasal drip or reflux, which are 99% of usually the cases of when people get that. Very important to look at it. And I know most of you have seen what this questionnaire looks like. So in my last book, How Can I Get Better? For those of you who are still struggling and trying to figure out what to do, I take the 16 MSIDS map points and I kind of get it down to 7 basic points for you. If you're a physician and a patient working together, the most important thing to know in rule 1 is symptoms drive diagnosis and treatment. So you don't keep checking your Lyme testing, your PCRs to figure out what you're going to do. If you have migratory pain that got better on antibiotics or herbs and you stop them and it's coming back, you still have active Lyme. If you had day sweats, night sweats, or chills, right, and air hunger, and you've ruled out other causes of day sweats and night sweats, you didn't have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, you didn't have tuberculosis, you didn't have hyperthyroidism, you didn't have malaria, you're not in menopause. Men, you're not in menopause, right? You don't have brucellosis, you don't have Q fever. I mean, you learn differential diagnosis after a while, right, as an internist. If you've ruled out these other diseases and your sweats are coming back when you've stopped your Malarone or your Mepron azithromax, you still have babesia, right? The striae on your skin may change color with Bartonella during treatment and it changes off. Look for all of the clues. But if you really look hard enough at the symptoms are going to tell you what to do. And that is why they told you in medical school early on that 90% of everything you're going to do with differential diagnosis is the patient is going to tell you the story and give you the history. It's also going to tell you, by the way, how to do the treatment. Every treatment needs to be individualized. The gentleman that I just saw today in my medical barn, his gut was a mess. This kid just got C. diff a couple of months ago because he was treated for strep throat and his doctor never put him on probiotics. So they had to give him Difficid and some oral vancomycin. He's got a lot of gas and bloating. His gut is a mess. He's allergic. He's probably got leaky gut with SIBO, with food allergies. So we're going to work on his gut first. We're going to work on his detox pathways for some neuropsychic symptoms. I'm not putting this kid on antibiotics. I'm working his detox in his gut because it's individualized. So symptoms drive diagnosis and treatment. Rule 2, lower inflammation. Every symptom you get in Lyme and COVID and most chronic acute disease is from inflammation, right? So that's why those pathways that I told you about earlier, so important. Number 3, we talked about it. If you don't detoxify, odds are you're not going to feel well. I've had patients come into my practice the first time for a Lyme consult with horrible brain fog. And I'll say to them, have you ever tried 2 grams of glutathione? And they'll go, no. I'll go, okay, I'm going to give you a shot of glutathione, 2,000 milligrams over 15 minutes. I walk back in the room. How's your brain? Oh my God, doc. I can think. I can remember words and numbers. I'm completely clear. It's like the light bulb went on. This particular patient was in a dark room for 2 years. He was a computer programmer. He had been treated for Lyme and Bark, but no one ever tried to detox him with glutathione. I just left him on NAC, alpha lipoic acid, and glut. His brain remained well. He eventually did double dose dapsone twice. He actually failed prior Bark treatments with Bartonella fish being positive. And I gave him a extended dapsone protocol the second month with 4 intracellular drugs. He's now in complete remission from the Lyme and the Bartonella. You've got to repair the damage we talked about with the mitochondria. Balance the hormones we talked about, adrenals, testosterone, sex hormones. Look at the microbiome in the gut. Get to sleep. Look at that diet. Gluten, food allergies, low histamine diet, hypoglycemia. 50% of my patients who come to see me have metabolic syndrome with reactive hypoglycemia. What are the symptoms of reactive hypoglycemia? Fatigue, palpitations, anxiety, brain fog, falling asleep, not being able to fall asleep. Sound familiar? Those are symptoms of hypoglycemia, and they're also symptoms of Lyme and long COVID. So you've got to get your diet in order and get small, frequent meals, 40% of good quality protein, 30% complex carbs, 30% healthy fats like olive oil, avocado, assuming, again, you're not histamine sensitive. And again, rule 7, heal the emotional wounds. This one slide for me kind of puts together why the MSIDS map works. If inflammation is the main reason why you're sick, you got to get to all the sources of inflammation. That's chronic infections, which for the most part is the top 3 Bs, Borrelia, Babesia, and Bartonella. But it doesn't mean you can't have brucella, we've seen it, or that you can't have tularemia, we've seen it, or you can't have Q fever, Coxiella burnetii, or you can't have viruses, HHV6 reactivation, Epstein-Barr reactivation, now been associated with MS, we see it. Dysbiosis, right? Look at the GI tract. Look for leaky gut and food allergies. Get them to sleep. Look at heavy metals and mold. That might be causing inflammation. And of course, the nutritional deficiencies that we talked about, zinc, copper, iodine, magnesium. But then you've got the downstream effects of all this inflammation. Low testosterone, low adrenal function, neuropsychiatric symptoms, POTS, mitochondrial dysfunction, pain syndromes, liver dysfunction, and autoimmune phenomena. So the common denominator under all of these is infections, toxins, leaky gut, dysbiosis, nutritional deficiencies, insomnia. All of these factors drive inflammation. They lead to autoimmune reactions and downstream effects. So you've got to get to all the sources of inflammation, and you got to drive down inflammation and heal the body. But also some of these infections are producing neurotoxins like quinolinic acid, or you may have heavy metal toxicity. One of the doctors who just recently came to me, who was complaining of brain fog and tinnitus, his mercury level was 26 in his blood because he loved sushi and was eating fish 5 times a week. Same thing with me. My mercury level was off the wall years ago. I had to cut back on fish consumption. So you have to be careful that you're not dealing with mercury, heavy metals, or quinolinic acid or mold toxins that are driving some of these neuropsychiatric symptoms. That's in part why we're going to check for the toxins, but also give them a 7-day trial of 2,000 milligrams of glutathione once a day for 7 days. And the patient emails me and says, how's your brain fog? How's your fatigue? How's your pain? I just need to know what detox is doing for your body so I understand the map of how your body is working, because it's all individualized. You can get autoantibodies. But what's interesting is the ANAs and rheumatoid factors and antithyroid antibodies and anti-thyroid peroxidase, and these anti-myelin antibodies, anti-ganglioside antibodies, all these autoimmune markers, a lot of them turn negative after proper Lyme treatment because Borrelia was stimulating this autoimmune reaction. And you know what else stimulates these autoimmune reactions? Toxicity from the environment. It's now been shown that BPA and asbestos and heavy metals and all of the toxins, the pesticides that are getting into your body, they are causing autoimmune reactions. So understanding that Borrelia causes autoimmune reactions and environmental toxins causes autoimmune reactions. Are you surprised that over 20 million Americans have an autoimmune disease of some form? You shouldn't be, because of how Lyme is in epidemic proportions, and so is environmental toxin exposure. So the problem in medicine right now, and I know I'm speaking to the choir, is they're naming a disease and throwing a drug at it instead of getting to the underlying sources of why it's there in the first place. So if you ever want to drive down the costs in healthcare, you can't have 46 million Americans with preclinical dementia and expect that's how you're going to do it. You got to get to the underlying sources of why people are becoming demented. And in my last book, How Can I Get Better? I found 9 out of 16 factors on the MSIDS map that talked about why people are getting dementia. Yet this model needs to be adopted on a broader basis. So anybody who would like me to run HHS in the government, please send in your nominations. Let the government know that it's time for Dr. H to kind of lead the way, and I'm happy to do it. MSIDS map, let me just give you a quick overview. By the way, I'm not sure they're going to listen to you in case you do that, but please feel free. You can tell the Tick-borne disease working group or whoever you know at HHS, they'll get a laugh. Bacterial diseases. Don't just look for Lyme. You have to look for other Borrelia species, meaning immunoblot 8 species, and look at relapsing fever, both soft ticks, hard tick relapsing fever, Borrelia miyamotoi. You're always going to look at Bartonella species. You can't just do Bartonella henselae or Quintana, right? You need to do an immunoblot Bartonella fish, use Galaxy. There's over 36 different species, strains, subspecies of Bartonella. So don't expect to find Bartonella vinsoni or Elizabethae or any of these subspecies on a standard Bartonella test from LabCorp. Also, same thing with mycoplasma. Multiple species of mycoplasma you're not going to find on the usual tests. Babesia duncani WAL1. And a lot of times the local labs won't even do WAL1. So we use IGeneX as our backup. And we always do Babesia fish testing in all of our patients with active day sweats, night sweats, chills. You may want to be able to probably got chronic Babesia affecting the ability to clear them. Viruses, we've seen Epstein-Barr % of our Lyme population was exposed when we published the study years ago. Now, that is a chronic viral infection that can get into your brain. We're not sure what flaviviruses are doing, but we have to worry about it because of also Powassan virus, which is a flavivirus. And they now know that in Lyme endemic areas, 10 to 16% of people living in Lyme endemic areas now have Powassan antibodies. Now, only 1 out of 150 people will get, thank God, Powassan encephalitis where they die, but Powassan gets in within 15 minutes of a tick bite. So you need to be doing tick prevention. We'll talk about this in just a bit with picaridin on your skin or IR3535 of mucotone, which is going to be coming out. You've got to be doing tick prevention and checking for ticks on a regular basis. Finally, Candida mold and fungi also plays a role in certain patients. You can look at immune markers. We talked about inflammation. You're going to check for toxins, heavy metals, mold. You can check for pesticides, even through some of the standard labs. You got to look for food allergies. Do extended food allergy profiles, not just an IgE, but an IgG. Nutritional enzyme deficiencies. We talked about mitochondrial dysfunction and psychological dysfunction. Lyme, as you know, causes a whole host of neurological dysfunction. We talked about looking at the hormones, really important, adrenals and sex hormones, anterior and posterior pituitary. Getting people to sleep, absolutely essential. POTS, we do this without a head-up tilt table test. I thought I was the first doctor to diagnose this with sitting and standing blood pressures and pulses. It turns out it was actually published years before I published it in the medical literature. But we do it by having you sit for 5 or 10 minutes, take your blood pressure and pulse with an electronic blood pressure machine. You stand up, and at 3 minutes, 6 minutes, and 9 minutes standing, you hit the button and you record your blood pressure and pulse. And if you get a heart rate that goes up 20, 30 beats per minute or more, you've got moderate to severe POTS. We don't always see the blood pressure go down, but it's very, very common to see the heart rate go up with it. You can do a head-up tilt table test, but this is kind of the poor man's easy way of diagnosing POTS. And again, if you've got dizziness standing up and you feel like you're passing out, or you do pass out often with fatigue, brain fog, palpitations, anxiety, those are the overlapping symptoms of POTS, and it will cause dysautonomia of the gut, where you can't move your bowels. So people that have Bell's palsy of the gut, that's dysautonomia. That's the autonomic nervous system and your vagus nerve affecting the gut. Or your bladder doesn't work properly. That's autonomic nervous system dysfunction of the bladder with the vagus nerve. So that's how you kind of know what's going on. We talked about looking for GI disorders. Elevated liver functions can happen from every tick-borne disease that you're exposed to. Same thing with pain syndromes. Resistant pain syndromes, we usually find Lyme, Babesia, Bartonella underlying with heavy metals and toxins, and finally, deconditioning. So these were the 2 studies that we published in the medical literature, Precision Medicine 1 on dapsone combination therapy, and Precision Medicine 2, the role of the MSIDS model. What we found in these people with the MSIDS abnormality is just about everybody who came in with chronic Lyme had most of the MSIDS abnormalities. The only one that was really not strong was the mitochondrial, but the reason we really couldn't tell what mitochondrial regeneration was doing is because people got so much better from double dose dapsone combination therapy, or in this study, actually, it was single dose. We weren't doing double dose as much. We found out that, they got so much better, we couldn't tell. Now, I wasn't doing lipid peroxides or mitochondrial markers on a regular basis, but they can be done. So why are we getting sick? As we talked about, the tests are just lacking adequate sensitivity. There were probably a lot of co-infections you're walking around with that your doctors have not tested for because of multiple species. A lot of these bugs can persist. Lyme can, Babesia can, Bartonella can, Mycoplasma can, Tularemia can, Brucella can, viruses can. You've got to look at all of these different infections which can persist. So that's in part why we're having this tremendous epidemic. So let's get to treatment. What do we now know? Well, for those people who are on the line who have probably heard this a million times, there are probably at this point hundreds of references that Lyme persists in the body. And I've asked the 3rd tick-borne disease working group, I've asked them online and I've asked them in person to please spend $500,000 because for HHS to do a scientific review of one question, it's like $250,000 or $500,000 to get 1 or 2 questions answered. What we need answered at this point is, how effective is Lyme testing for the general population? And does Lyme persist? Those 2 questions, we need to spend some money at the 3rd tick-borne working group to get this answered, because if it's not answered by the end of this 2 years, I'm afraid it's not going to happen. The scientific studies show it definitely persists. In the study we published on 200 dapsone patients, what we found, 14.5% of our patients were PCR positive for Lyme, and it didn't matter whether they had been treated for months or for years. Now, again, this is before using a lot of persistor biofilm agents that I'm about to talk to you about. Babesia persisted. It didn't matter whether you used Mepron, Azithromax, or Malarone, Coartem, or Tefenequin, or any of the different antimalarials, Cryptolepis, Artemisia, Neem. It kept persisting. Bartonella was persisting by PCR in fish. Tularemia was relapsing. We saw agglutination positive for Brucella. It was active. We saw different Mycoplasma species in this population, and they were on double intracellular antibiotics, and we saw viral reactivation. So what really made the difference a couple of years ago is the biofilms. These biofilms are protecting the bacteria. And Ying Zhang and his colleagues published at JHU that these stationary phase persisters, these infections that are dormant, they're not actively replicating in the biofilms, these are driving a lot of the inflammation that's going on in your body. So we published a study on dapsone alone in combination against the biofilm forms of Borrelia in culture. Now, I do things backward. As a clinician, I figure out first what is the regimen that works, and then I go back to culture and try and prove that what's actually working in clinic actually has an effect in culture, and that's exactly what we showed. Thank God. Otherwise, I would have looked fairly foolish. What we showed in culture, if you look at K at the bottom right, dapsone doxyrifampin, you'll notice there's a little green blip. And then if you go over to L, you can barely see the biofilm form after 72 hours. Look at doxy at the top left, D. Doxy's not doing much for your biofilms. Look at G all the way to the right top, azithromycin. It's not really doing much for your biofilms. You're noticing that when you use these multiple intracellular drugs in combo, and the more of these drugs you use, guess what? The better it works against the biofilms and the persister forms. So what the study showed is dapsone alone, or doxydapsone, which worked better, or doxydapsone and rifampin, which worked even better, or doxyrifampin, dapsone, and azithromycin had the best effect in reducing the mass and viability, as well as these protective mucopolysaccharide layers that are protecting Borrelia burgdorferi in the biofilm. And these findings might at least explain in part why we're seeing such efficacy to dapsone combination therapy. We then published in the journal Antibiotics efficacy of double-dose dapsone combination therapy in the treatment of chronic Lyme disease, and the first study that's ever been published on PTLDS, because according to John Hopkins and everyone out there, we don't know what PTLDS is. We don't know how to help these people. The treatment response in these 40 patients, which, by the way, we've now treated we're probably getting close to 1,000 patients with dapsone, not all double dose dapsone, but a lot of patients on dapsone combination therapy, 7 to 8 weeks, safe and effective. It was superior. The higher the dose of dapsone we used, the better it worked. It put 45% of patients in 1 year or longer into remission. And this, by the way, didn't matter whether you were sick for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, roughly 50% went into long-term remission. And in those who had an EM rash with PTLDS, it was a 58% remission rate. Now, this is unheard of. It is the first study that's ever been published that an 8-week course of antibiotics can help put a Lyme patient sick for decades in long-term remission. But you've got to address all of these MSIDS factors that I just told you about. Because if you've got low adrenals, or you've got POTS, or you've leaky gut, or you've got mast cell disorder, or you're not sleeping, or you didn't deal with your emotional wounds, if all of these things are present, you're not going to get the full effect. So the key for the talk tonight is ask your doctor about double-dose dapsone combination therapy and make sure you've gotten to all the factors on the MSIDS model. So why didn't it work when it didn't? Well, if you go over to the right top, Bartfish positive, you'll notice 7 out of these 40 people who were Bartfish positive, none of them went into remission. So the biggest factor stopping double-dose dapsone from working in long-term remission is BART. If you were Babesia fish positive, which was 3 out of 6, you still had a 50% chance was the same as double-dose dapsone. It was really the Bartonella that was interfering most times. So up until now, and I talked to you about this earlier, the comprehensive treatment for Lyme is log phase actively dividing with penicillins or cephalosporins, hitting the round body forms, intracellular, which is mostly what I'm doing these days, a tetra like doxy or minnow, with or without a macrolide, azithro, clarithrol, or roxithromycin has to be compounded. Rifampin or rifabutin has a longer half-life, but you have to watch the white cell counts and platelets and liver functions. There's more effects of that on rifabutin. We don't usually use quinolones much these days, but especially the importance of the stationary phase persisters and biofilms. And that's where dapsone and disulfiram plays a role. And that's why acetylocillin and hygromycin A may be playing a role in the future. So the work that Dr. Liegner's done on disulfiram, which initially came out of Stanford University, and Dr. Podanini, showed that in his first study, 71 patients treated with disulfiram in 2 groups, high dose or low dose, 36% went into long-term remission, greater than 6 months. or they had to take it for 6 weeks up to more than a year. So again, I will point out remission rates with dapsone around 50% for 8 weeks, disulfiram 36% up to 16 months. Adverse reactions, fatigue, 2/3, psychiatric symptoms, almost half. Peripheral neuropathy is one of the worst. You have to be very careful. By the way, this is why we don't use more than 250 milligrams of disulfiram anymore in our practice. A lot of patients are on 125 or even 187.5, and we're mixing it with dapsone. We're finding that 2 persister drugs does work better than 1 in many of these patients. So azlocillin may be coming out this year. We're waiting for Stanford to finally get this out there. It's a potential drug candidate against drug-tolerant Borrelia. And hygromycin A was discovered by Kim Lewis. It's smuggled into the spirochetes by a transporter. And what he particularly likes about it is that it's supposed to be hitting Borrelia without disrupting the microbiome. Now, I will tell you that dapsone, from what I can see, has no effect on the microbiome. And I don't think disulfiram does either. Doxyrifampin, of course it does. But keeping in mind that hygromycin A is not necessarily going to do anything for your Bartonella or your Babesia or your other intracellular infections. And most of my patients, be clear when I finish this talk, most of my patients have mycoplasma, many have tularemia, some have had Q fever, pretty much all of them have Babesia and Bartonella with multiple species. They have multiple intracellular pathogens. So even if hygromycin A happens to work for Lyme, it's not going to work for all these co-infections, which is why I like this combination dapsone therapy, because this combination of a tetracycline with rifampin with dapsone, it doesn't matter what your intracellular pathogen is called. Ehrlichia, anaplasma, tularemia, Q fever, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, typhus. Doesn't matter what it's called. That regimen hits it, even if you didn't know you had it. That's the beauty of using this broad spectrum regimen. And we use triple probiotics like Theralac, Orthobiotics, Saccharomyces boulardii, sometimes Probiomax 100 billion. We don't have problems with the microbiome, and we keep these people on probiotics afterwards to make sure the microbiome is safe. So hygromycin A coming down the pike. Azlocillin was shown to kill late log phase and 7-day stationary phase persister Lyme. Combined with cefotaxime, it killed doxy-tolerant Beaver dorferi. But again, these are IV drugs. Why would you use an IV drug if you didn't have to? So we need clinical studies. And the new study I will be publishing later this year is on high-dose pulse dapsone because of the patient who accidentally took a quadruple dapsone dose for 4 days, felt sick as a dog, stopped it, was sick for 15 years, and now she's going on about a year in remission. So we decided to give this to some of our resistant patients. And it's really interesting, the results that I'm seeing. As I said to you earlier, 200 milligrams of dapsone seems to work better than 100. 400 milligrams of dapsone seems to work better than 200, but we're only doing it for 4 days. These are really short pulses and then getting off of it. Not enough time to get anemic. The methylene blue and glutathione drives down methemoglobin levels. So generally, we're having it controlled. And some people with resistant symptoms that did not get better with any other protocol, and I have to collect the data, but I'm hearing all of these results like, doc, the 3rd time I did it, all of a sudden my brain was clear. Doc, the 1st time I did it and I had done double dose dapsone and gotten better, all of a sudden I'm at 98% and my neuropathy is much better. Now, it's only 40 to 45 patients that have done it. And what I'm getting from patients is pretty much all over the map. So when I get back from vacation in mid-March, I'm going to start to collect the data. I expect to publish it in the summer. And now let me finish off with climate. So we know that Lyme is spreading worldwide, but what is climate change doing to not just Lyme, but all other infections? It is basically hastening a lot of infectious disease spread worldwide. So we know since the 1990s, a warmer climate has shortened the winters. Lyme is now coming out, by the way, 3 weeks earlier than it did a century ago. High altitudes and attitudes now seem poised. We used to think that, for example, high up in Colorado, you weren't going to see too many ticks. They're now climbing up the mountains. And the tick vectors that are spreading Lyme, or the mosquito vectors that are spreading dengue fever, malaria, chikungunya, Zika, West Nile, they're now starting to increase because as there is global warming, we're now 1.1 to 1.2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. Insects' body temperatures are basically mimicking what's going out in the outside environment. So if their internal temperature is warmer, their reproductive rate is higher. So as the climate advances, all of these infectious diseases are starting to go up. Present US policy is inadequate to control the rise in vector-borne disease. Well, we already know this because of what's happened with Lyme, but what they're finding is some of the chemicals like they're using to treat the mosquitoes, some of these pesticides, they're basically causing them now to become resistant, not to mention all the horrible side effects of what pesticides do to the body, including being associated with Alzheimer's disease. Pesticides have been associated with Parkinson's, apart from things they're finding in the microbiome of the gut and genetics and everything else. So inattention to long-term management of disease-spreading arthropods is now causing a big problem. And the ticks are spreading to places that they've never been. The Lone Star tick is now throughout the Northeast, and they've now started to find Gulf Coast ticks in New York City. So the Lone Star tick is now on Long Island. And just so you can remember, what does the Lone Star tick transmit? I call it, you have a risk of tears, tularemia, Ehrlichia, alpha-gal, rickettsia, stari. That's a quick synonym to be able to remember what is in the Lone Star tick. And nymphites, people who go to Long Island and they say, Doc, I got all these chigger bites. What you think are chigger bites may actually be Lone Star tick nymphs. And that's how people get alpha-gal allergies, where all of a sudden they have these anaphylactic type reactions to eating meat and meat products. So Gulf Coast ticks have now decided to take a vacation to New York City and the boroughs. What is the risk is Rickettsia parkeri. So let me explain the difference with Rocky Mountain spotted fever and Rickettsia parkeri. They have similar signs and symptoms: fever, headaches, muscle aches, and rash. Now, the key to any rickettsial infection, if you suspect someone got a rickettsial infection, do you wait for an antibody test? No. Do you wait for a PCR test? No. Why don't you wait? Because it is life-threatening. If you get Rocky Mountain spotted fever and you don't get it within the first 7 days with a tetracycline like Doxy, you can die. People have lost limbs with necrosis because they have not been treated for rickettsial infections. The difference is Rickettsia parkeri ricketsiosis is not quite as severe, but you can't tell with the symptoms. The only way you can tell is there's an inoculation site. It's called an SCAR, where you get the bite, which you do not get with Rocky Mountain spotted fever. You get similar lab tests where you might get a slight decrease in your white cell count with leukopenia. Platelets might go a little low, thrombocytopenia, very slight elevations in liver functions. You see this with Rocky Mountain spotted fever. You see with Rickettsia parkeri ricketsiosis. But the antibody test cross-reacts. So if you get a positive test for Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and by the way, 10% of them are false positives. That's been shown by the CDC, and we found the same thing in our study. Positive test for Rocky Mountain spotted fever could mean a positive test for Rickettsia parkeri. So you're going to look for a fourfold rise in antibody titers. IgG is more specific than IgM, and you can do PCRs. What else is happening with climate change and ticks and global health? So ticks are now coming out 3 weeks earlier. Rick Osfeld from the Institute of Ecosystem Studies showed this. Higher global temperatures, we said, are increasing the reproductive rate of insects. Climate change is increasing toxins, wildfire smoke, that a lot of my Lyme patients in California were basically indoors for weeks and had to get HEPA filters, or if they did go outside, they had to use N95 masks, and they still got exposed to this small particle pollution. And there's hundreds of toxic chemicals in wildfire smoke. It is very toxic. You need to keep your detox pathways going. And these are the people, by the way, that should be doing sauna therapy, should be working all of your detox pathways. Look in my book under Lyme and functional medicine about saunas and detoxing through the skin and getting the bowels and the kidneys. You need to be working all of your detox pathways. But there's also now a risk of heat strokes, dehydration, increases in asthma and cardiac events. And what's interesting about tick exposure is after a wildfire, Ixodes ticks that were present in the area at the wildfire, they then checked the areas as it was growing back. And what they then found was it was now only 59% Ixodes, but almost 45% dermatocentric ticks. Dermatocentric ticks are the ones that spread rickettsial disease. So wildfire is actually even changing the types of ticks in the tick population that is out there. And then there is the major issue, and this is one of the greatest risks we face in the next 20 years, 30 years, is biodiversity collapse and the spread of infectious disease. This was just published in the Journal of Pediatrics and Child Health, the impact of climate change and biodiversity collapse on the global emergence and spread of infectious diseases. So the reality of climate change and biodiversity collapse, it is now irrefutable for the 21st century. And I need for you to understand what biodiversity collapse means. We rely on the ecosystem, on pollinators, on bees, on plants to make food. If you lose your pollinators and your essential plants, your food production is going to go down. Well, the ecosystem is now showing signs of stress. This is one of the greatest existential threats that humanity has ever faced. I want to be clear about this. I don't spend my time kind of dealing with issues that are not big issues. That is why I wrote this third book, Starseed Revolution. I took on Lyme because I saw the importance of it. I took on COVID because I saw the importance. You need to learn about this because this is going to affect you and all future generations on these planets. And what they're finding is that the ecosystems that are sustaining life on this planet are now becoming extremely fragile. There are complex feedback loops underlying this ecological stability that are at risk of unraveling when we hit certain tipping points. So scientists have determined that we're in the early stages of our sixth extinction. If you have not read Elizabeth Kolbert's book, The Sixth Extinction, this is not a science fiction book. She won the Pulitzer Prize for this. What she has showed is that we are now in the early stages, and they are predicting in the year 2040 to 50 that 25 to 33% of all the species on this planet will be extinct, including bees and pollinators, insects, multiple species of fish from warmer polluted waters that have now been acidified from carbon dioxide getting into the ocean and acidifying the ocean, and certain mammals will be extinct. And this excess man-made carbon and methane pollution is causing the permafrost, which is no longer permanently frozen, in Antarctica, in Greenland to melt, and it's setting off these climate feedback loops. And they're expecting it to get to minimum 2 degrees centigrade rise. Now, what you're seeing now with wildfires and droughts and hurricanes and tornadoes and vector-borne, all of this is at 1.1 degree. I can't even imagine 2 degrees, but all of what we're going to be seeing is more rising sea levels, droughts, flooding, more forest fires. You saw there was forest fires in Alaska that never happened. California, you know about with Colorado, but even in Siberia, they were seeing it with 100-degree days where ice floes were melting in the middle of the summer. Never seen in Siberia before. And Australia had massive fires where they lost billions of animals. So it's increasing the severity of hurricanes, tornadoes, epidemics, water and food insecurity, and climate refugees because people are going to be moving from where they're living. And the Department of Defense has clearly been talking about this as a national security risk. They started one of their first reports in January 2019, looking at recurrent flooding, droughts, desertification, wildlife thawing, and permafrost. So this Build Back Better Act that's now in Congress, please contact your senators. We need to have resiliency for what is about to be coming. And why is it speeding up? And this is what's concerning me the most. They're showing now spiking methane emissions. Now, methane is 30 to 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And there's twice as much carbon dioxide in the permafrost with methane as there is in our present atmosphere. So they showed that global methane concentration have now nearly tripled. Data released in this past January, just a month ago, by the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, showed that our methane levels have raced past 1,900 parts per billion. And now researchers are thinking that global warming is creating a feedback mechanism that as it gets warmer and the permafrost is melting, releasing more methane, it's going to make it warmer, releasing more methane. And basically this is going to be like a train that you can't stop on the tracks. Nitric oxide, by the way, which is also being produced from agricultural practices, because we're not doing regenerative agriculture, has a warming effect of over 200-fold. So this UN IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, basically said there is no doubt human activity is driving the climate emergency. This is almost a 4,000-page panel report from every country in the world. It is the gold standard, and it says that if we don't act immediately, decisively, we might hit 4 degrees centigrade, and at the upper end of the probability curve, 8 degrees. And the last time our planet was 4 degrees higher and warmer, the oceans were 100 feet higher. Just take a look at the Dover Cliffs in England. That's where it was millions of years ago. Human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented during the last 2,000 years. This is from the IPCC report. and it is affecting every inhabited region across the globe. There is not one area that is now being affected by changes in climate. One of the greatest threats, which is why I'm asking you please to pre-order the book and go on your social media sites and spread it, is because I need a voice in the climate dialogue because of what I'm about to show you on the slide right here, because this is not being talked about enough in the mainstream media. There is a glacier in West Antarctica called the Thwaites Glacier. The demise of this Thwaites Glacier, which is about the size of Florida, would raise sea levels a minimum of 2 to 3 feet. It's already losing 50 billion tons of ice each year. It's responsible for 4% of global sea level rise. And if it collapses into the ocean, what's happening is you're only seeing the top of the glacier. 90% is under the water, and the warmer waters in the Arctic are melting the glacier, which means that New York City, Miami, any coastal city in the US, Venice, Amsterdam, any place in Asia will start to be underwater. And scientists are predicting a potential collapse within the next 3 to 5 years, with spiking methane contributing to the problem. Now, in the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, they measured recently 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide. When was the last time we had 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide? Was the Pliocene era on the Earth millions of years ago, and the oceans at that point were 30 to 80 feet higher. Please, let's not stick our heads in the sand as ostriches and say, this can never happen to us. I'm telling you now, we are in danger. And that is why I'm asking for your support, because when I get on the news media feeds and I start talking about this and the book gets on the New York Times and national bestseller, I will highlight what the climate is doing for your predicament of Lyme. I will talk about environmental toxins, and I will talk about what's going to happen at a 2-degree rise. And I have solutions. This is all not bad news that I'm sharing with you. There are solutions that are not being discussed in the mainstream media, which is why I need a voice. If we get a 2-degree centigrade rise, which is where we're going, because COP26 did nothing. They made pledges, and all that happened after COVID-19 was over was an increase in carbon dioxide and methane. We're going to get massive glacial melts in Antarctica, flooding in low-lying areas, and destruction of farmland. Our food supply is going to start to be affected. We're going to see tens of millions of climate refugees, and hardest hit will be disadvantaged and poor nations. If you haven't seen the Caribbean in a couple of years, you may want to go see it now, because the way it's going, the Caribbean is going to be underwater. This is not a joke in the next 10 years. And already they're predicting, if you have not actually listened to the leaders of Caribbean countries, they're asking us now to be able to move the climate refugees and to do something, because they already know that they're going to lose where they're living. These are the IPCC reported health risks: heat-related morbidity and mortality with increased heat strokes, ozone-related mortality with worsening of emphysema, asthma, and respiratory problems, more mold toxins from hurricanes and flooding, more wildfire smoke with toxins and small particle pollution, which has been linked up to preclinical dementia, to Alzheimer's, to Parkinson's, and a whole host of diseases, cardiac and pulmonary. More vector-borne diseases from increased mosquitoes, ticks, and fleas on the planet. New viral and bacterial diseases, because as the permafrost melts, there are viruses and bacteria that humans have never been exposed to in hundreds of thousands to millions of years that are going to be released that we have no natural immunity. COVID-19, COVID-24, all over again. There will be malnutrition and decreases in food supply, and livestock populations will go down as the fish supply goes down because of acidification of the ocean. So the 3 I's of infections, toxins, and nutritional deficiency, this is going to be very important that we now start paying attention to these 3 I's to protect ourselves because of what is now happening on the planet. So transform planetary health through transformation of social, political, medical, energy, and economic structures. I discuss transforming personal health through the 3 I's. And I discuss transforming the world through quantum physical principles, even meditation. And this will be at the end of the book, and I don't want to give away what's in there, but I call it the 1% global climate solutions. But the solutions that need to be integrated immediately, which are highlighted, is because of the Thwaites Glacier. You know, if you have medical problems, if you're a Lyme patient with 9 problems, but you've got a melanoma on your arm that's about to spread, Yes, you have to deal with the Lyme and those other problems. Destroy you. Well, this is what the Thwaites Glacier represents in the next 3 to 5 years. What is the solution? And I started this research in 2018. The last time a volcano in the Philippines erupted in 1991, it cooled the planet by 0.5 degree centigrade for many, many years. There's a way to seed sulfates over Antarctica, over this glacier, not the rest of the world, to cool this down, because if the ice cube is melting, you need to cool this down, you need to cool the oceans and stop the glacier from melting. It can be done with sulfate seeding, marine cloud brightening, where they actually spray salt water into the clouds and it reflects sunlight. And Harvard University has physicists working on 1 million miles of solar reflectors in the ocean to reflect back the UV radiation. And finally, Mark Jacobson, who has a quote for our book, who comes from Stanford University, he published an article in One Earth on how to achieve wind, water, and solar and get off all fossil fuels for 139 countries. And Mark is highlighted in this book. So I want to be clear, solutions are there. But the way the global leaders and people are acting as if we don't have solutions, we're going to be carbon neutral in 30 years. Folks, I'm telling you clearly, in 30 years, it's going to be way too late with biodiversity collapse, the Thwaites Glacier, and these infectious diseases. You need to be getting on the phones to your senator to pass these bills. You need to be highlighting the climate. You need to be learning about it, learning about resilience. And again, as the permafrost melts, these new infections may be released, triggering another pandemic. This has been published. The 2 articles about this are on the right side of your screen. And again, this is not talking about what's happening now. This is talking about we already went through COVID. We don't want to go through this again. So prevention is more important than ever. If you are someone who's not been using picaridin 20% on your skin, permethrin-treated clothing, Nucatone will hopefully be coming out soon, but you got to be doing tick checks. Put your clothes in a hot dryer for 10 minutes when you come inside. They're looking at PrEP, prophylactic exposure for Lyme, with anti-OspA human monoclonal antibodies. Early studies, by the way, showed 100% protection. This is similar to the monoclonal antibodies they've been using for COVID. It's actually a very interesting approach. Bait boxes, New York Tick Control has been using them. We've got them around our property. They're talking about bait vaccines, anti-tick vaccines to block transmission, fungus that destroy the ticks, Wolbachia species, transgenic ticks with CRISPR, acaricides, pheromones. There's a lot of things going on. But we need to start doing this to bring down the tick populations. And you probably know there's an OSC vaccine, Valneva vaccine, that's going to be coming out soon. So in conclusion, Lyme disease and COVID, they have similar symptoms due to the triage: infection, immune dysfunction, and inflammation. They're clinical diagnoses. There's a 30% false negative rate of antibody PCR testing in COVID. There's a 45% false negative rate in Lyme. So you've got to learn the symptoms so you can make the diagnosis. But again, long haulers are going to overlap a lot of chronic Lymers. Consider treating COVID with the regimen I talked to you about by blocking NF-kappa B, stimulating NRF2, and blocking NLR3 inflammasomes. Look at ivermectin protocols. And again, it's on my website, cangetbetter.com, under COVID. Consider treating Lyme by first screening with the 16-point MSIDS map, creating a differential diagnosis. And if you have not tried these persistent biofilm agents, please do it. It is making a huge difference in my patients who've been sick for decades. Dapsone combination therapy, with or without disulfiram, are newer treatments with biofilm agents that are definitely making a difference. As I said, dapsone combination therapy, roughly a 50% rate for a year or longer with an 8-week protocol, versus disulfiram, roughly 37%, 6 weeks to 16 months. Dapsone has potential short-term side effects with anemia, methylmaglobulinemia, but it has less long-term side effects than disulfiram. You don't see, so dapsone combination therapy helps neuropathy. It doesn't cause it, okay? Dapsone combination therapy helps neuropsychiatric symptoms. It doesn't cause it. But I am using the drugs together in lower doses, and I am finding it to be effective. The next step is we need randomized trials for dapsone and disulfiram, looking maybe even combining these two. We need to be looking at new treatment protocols for Babesia and Bartonella and these resistant biofilms forms. And again, I think this high-dose pulse quadruple dapsone is really fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to accumulating the data and giving you some new treatment options for later this year. And again, please educate yourself on the climate, learn about solutions and resiliency, because prevention is more important than ever to reverse the worst effects of climate change. Again, especially because of what they're calling the doomsday glacier, which in 3 to 5 years may be cracking in the ocean. So my new book, Starseed Revolution, The Awakening, it is live in 2 weeks on March 1st. Anyone you love for Valentine's Day, tell them you love them with a book from Dr. H. If you want a book plate signed for them, just email my office. I'm happy to send you a book plate for it. And again, I will be in New York City at IHS this next Thursday at 5 o'clock with a book signing for one who want to get an early copy. And we got Kirkus Reviews, a major book reviewer, to give a review for us. This fusion of eco-thriller, new age powered speculative fiction, brutal social commentary. For those of you who want to know how I feel about how we have handled Lyme and Tick-borne, you're going to love the social commentary in this book. And comedic science fiction a la Douglas Adams offers sagacious solutions to the present day climate crisis, a strange little gem of a tale or an allegorical how-to guide on Save the Planet. It is a guide to save the planet. Only time will tell. An odd but thematically profound and engrossing cli-fi climate science fiction tale. So please go on my website, starseedrevolution.com. I have a lot of information. If you've not seen my videos and you need a good laugh, please go under starseed-revolution.com/video. Look at me playing Prince Inn of Arcturus. I promise you some good laughs. I'm even on TikTok. I'm putting out about 1 TikTok a day for the younger generation. I think you'll enjoy it if you see it. So again, thank you so much for your attention. And if we have time, we'll just take a couple of questions.
All right, Dr. Horowitz, thank you so very much. Totally amazing as usual. And we did have some interesting, a couple questions that I figured I'd throw out there. And then maybe we'll have a few more come in. But, there was a question about, does Lyme cause chronic issues such as chronic sinusitis, chronic sore throats? Many of the other sort of things that we talk about, mycotoxins, pandas may have that as a potential pathogenesis, but what about Lyme itself?
Most of the people who come in with sinus problems, like the guy actually I just saw today, when I examined him, his turbinates, there was no air getting through. They were completely swollen. He tried to have his deviated septum done. It made no difference. This kid's IgE levels, he was allergic. I think they were like around 400. He hadn't had his leaky gut checked. So most of the sore throats, from my perspective, is most of the time in sinus, you're looking at mold and allergens from the environment, whether it's environmental allergens with trees and grasses, or whether it's mold that has gotten into your sinuses. But even food allergies, these people who are histamine sensitive, who have mast cell activation, like I used to have chronic sinus problems all the time, or asthma. Once I figured out that I was histamine sensitive, primarily to dairy, right? I got off dairy, my sinuses are fine. I don't need asthma sprays. Unfortunately, dark chocolate is also a histamine trigger, and I can't eat it these days. So I'm not sure why God programmed people that way. That's cruel. Dark chocolate causing itching. I mean, why? If I was creator of the universe, I wouldn't have done that. In any case, the histamine foods, the allergic foods, mold, I would really go after that if you have sinus problems. Anybody there eating dark chocolate? You're smiling when I'm saying that. Those are the things I would go after if you've got, sinus problems and sore throats.
Yeah, that's been my clinical experience as well. So thank you very much for that. And, is that caffeine on your mug there?
It's tea, but it's a caffeine molecule. So even though I'm not getting a lot of caffeine, I'm getting the vibes of caffeine in there to keep me awake to do talks like this.
That's all you really need. I'm thinking I can see a new product line where you're having chocolate and quercetin mixed together, maybe some red wine with quercetin.
Tom, you and I need to talk after this. Yes.
It sounds really good. Well, Dr. Horowitz, I want to say thank you so much for being here and taking time out to do this with us. And I wanted to let some folks know, YouTube did its normal thing in the very beginning. So we had a little delay, but we got it going. And I just wanted to let you all know that the recording will be posted. We'll be emailing it out to everybody. So we do have a backup plan if the YouTube doesn't load the first little bit of the talk. So we'll make sure you get all that. And that'll be going out later tonight or tomorrow. And again, head over to Starseed. It's starseed-revolution.com.
Yeah, the website is www.starseed-revolution.com. And please look at the videos. Tom, when you watched them, you had a hearty laugh.
Exactly. And you'll understand why Dr. Horowitz and I get along so well and why this is so important on both a physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, global, and comedic level. So we need a little bit more laughter with all of what's been going on, and also a lot of education. So I'd go check it out. There's amazing videos on the website. Again, like Dr. Horowitz said, check out TikTok. It's the only reason I would actually go on TikTok personally. So go check it out. Good stuff. And one of the other questions too was just your other website, and that's cangetbetter.com.
Correct. The medical website is cangetbetter.com. The other website is starseed-revolution.com.
All right. Thank you so much. We all love you over here, and everyone have a great
Lots
evening.
of love to you guys too. Everybody be well. Enjoy your time there. And I hope you get some snow there, Tom.
Thanks, Rich. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Take care.
So long.